If a place can forget you, it will. That was the first thought Daniel Carter had when he stepped out of his truck and looked at the ranch he had inherited from his grandfather. The wind rolled across the open land in slow, dry waves, carrying the scent of old wood, dry soil, and something faintly metallic that he could not immediately place. The property stretched far beyond what he remembered from childhood visits. Or maybe it only felt larger now because of how empty it had become. Fences leaned at uneven angles, weathered by years of neglect. The barn stood at the far end of the property like a silent structure refusing to collapse, even though everything around it suggested it should have. Daniel adjusted the strap of his bag and took a slow step forward. He had served years in the military, seen environments where structure meant survival, and this place did not feel dangerous in the traditional sense. It felt abandoned by intention. Behind him, the engine of his truck ticked as it cooled, the only modern sound in an otherwise silent landscape. Then he heard movement. Not from the wind, from the ground. A German shepherd stepped down from the truck bed with controlled precision, scanning the environment immediately. Rex, his companion, did not hesitate or explore randomly. His attention locked forward toward the barn, as if he had already identified something before Daniel had even processed the space fully. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and exhaled slowly. "It is just property," he said quietly, though the words sounded uncertain even to him. Rex did not respond to the statement. Instead, he began walking forward at a steady pace, not fast, not cautious, but deliberate. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his boots pressing into dry grass that bent but did not recover quickly. As they approached the main house and passed it without stopping, Daniel noticed something that did not fit. The barn was not simply old. It looked structurally inconsistent. Certain sections of wood appeared too intact compared to the surrounding decay, as if replaced or reinforced more recently than the rest of the structure. He slowed his pace slightly. "That does not make sense," he muttered. Rex stopped at the edge of the barn entrance. Not inside, not away, right at the threshold. His body shifted slightly, head angled downward toward the floorboards near the corner of the structure. Daniel approached slowly, watching the dog's behavior rather than the building itself. Rex did not move from that exact point. He lowered his head and inhaled once, then again, focusing on a specific section of wood as if confirming something beneath it. Daniel knelt down and placed his hand on the barn floor. The wood felt solid at first, but when he applied slight pressure, there was a faint difference in sound beneath it. Not a crack, not damage, something deeper, hollow, but controlled. He stood up slowly, looking at Rex. "You are not reacting to the barn," he said quietly. "You are reacting to what is under it." Rex remained still, eyes fixed on the same point, as if waiting for Daniel to finally understand what he had already detected. Daniel stayed near the barn entrance, still focused on the exact section of floor where Rex had stopped. The silence around them felt heavier now, as if the entire property was holding its breath alongside them. The wind continued moving across the open land, but it seemed weaker near the structure, as though something about the barn itself disrupted the natural flow of the environment. Rex remained fixed in position, his attention locked downward at the same point beneath the wooden boards. Daniel slowly knelt again, this time pressing his palm more deliberately against the surface. The wood responded with a subtle difference in sound, not broken or loose, but layered, as if multiple surfaces were stacked beneath each other in a way that did not match standard construction. He tapped once with his knuckles. The sound returned dull and delayed, confirming what he had begun to suspect. "There is space under here," he said quietly, his voice controlled but increasingly focused. Rex shifted slightly, stepping half a pace to the left, then lowering his head again toward a second point along the same section of floor. It was not random movement. It was precise, as if the dog was mapping variations in structure, rather than simply reacting to scent or sound. Daniel followed the dog's adjustment and moved his hand to the new location. The difference was subtle but clear. The resonance changed again. Not uniform, not consistent. Intentional variation within the same surface. He stood up slowly and looked across the barn interior. From the outside, it appeared like a simple rural structure, aged and forgotten. But from inside, the inconsistencies suggested modification, reinforcement, and concealment. Sections of the floor did not align perfectly with the supporting beams beneath, and certain nails appeared newer than the surrounding wood. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is not just old construction," he murmured. Rex remained calm but unwavering, still focused on the same general area, as if confirming that Daniel was now aligned with his detection. Daniel walked a few steps along the barn floor, testing different sections with careful pressure. In several places, the sound changed slightly, always returning to that same hollow indication beneath the surface. It was not an empty void in a structural failure sense. It felt controlled, contained, and deliberately maintained. He stopped near the center of the barn and looked down again. "Something was built under this," he said quietly, "and it was built to stay hidden." Rex turned his head slightly toward Daniel, then back to the floor, reinforcing the exact point of interest without moving away from it. Daniel studied the surrounding structure more carefully now, noticing that the barn itself seemed to be designed with uneven distribution, as if certain sections carried more weight or reinforced support than others. It did not feel accidental. It felt arranged. He stepped back a little, taking in the entire space. The barn was no longer just an inherited structure on neglected land. It was beginning to look like a cover for something far more deliberate, and whatever lay beneath it had already been found by the only presence on the property that had not ignored it from the beginning. Daniel remained inside the barn, slowly shifting his position across the worn wooden floor as he tried to understand the inconsistencies. Beneath his feet, the silence inside the structure felt denser than outside, as if the walls themselves were absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. Rex stayed close to the original detection point, but now his attention occasionally shifted between two nearby sections of floor, suggesting that the anomaly was not isolated to a single board but part of a broader concealed pattern. Daniel crouched again and pressed down with both hands, applying even pressure across a wider area. The response was subtle but undeniable. The sound beneath the wood changed in layers, confirming that the hollow space extended beyond one fixed location. He slowly stood and looked toward the barn's far corner, where older support beams intersected in a way that did not match standard agricultural construction. "This was modified," he said quietly, more to himself than to Rex. "Not repaired. Modified." Rex moved forward a few steps, then stopped again near the intersection of two beams. He lowered his head and focused on the seam where wood met structural support. Daniel followed and knelt beside him. At this point, the irregularities were no longer subtle. Nail placements were inconsistent across different sections, and some boards appeared to have been replaced more recently than others, despite the overall aged appearance of the barn. It was as if parts of the structure had been selectively maintained while everything else was allowed to deteriorate naturally. Daniel ran his hand along the beam line, feeling a slight variation in density beneath the surface. He tapped once, then again, and the sound confirmed a deeper cavity below, not random empty space, but a continuous gap extending along a defined direction. Rex suddenly shifted his stance and moved toward the opposite side of the barn interior, stopping at another seemingly ordinary section of flooring. Daniel stood and followed him immediately, recognizing the pattern. The dog was not circling randomly. He was tracing boundaries. Daniel crouched at the new point and applied pressure again. The same hollow response returned, consistent with the previous area. A realization began forming in his mind. These were not separate anomalies. They were connected sections of a single hidden structure beneath the barn floor. He stood slowly and scanned the entire interior again, this time noticing how the support beams subtly aligned in a way that could accommodate something larger underneath without collapsing the visible structure above. "This is not random," he said quietly. "This is planned space." Rex remained still, his gaze fixed downward, as if confirming the conclusion without needing further verification. Daniel walked slowly toward the center of the barn again, now seeing the floor not as a solid surface, but as a layered system concealing something intentionally integrated into the property's design. The more he observed, the clearer it became that the barn itself was never meant to be just a storage structure. It was a cover, and whatever lay beneath it had been deliberately concealed for a long time, waiting for someone or something to recognize what had been hidden in plain sight. Daniel stood in the center of the barn for a long moment, no longer moving, letting his attention fully adjust to the idea that the entire floor beneath him might be part of a concealed structure. The silence inside the barn felt different now, no longer passive but structured, as if the space itself was designed to suppress sound in specific areas while allowing it to resonate in others. Rex remained near the previous detection line, but his focus stayed locked on the ground, occasionally shifting a few inches at a time, mapping invisible boundaries only he seemed capable of recognizing. Daniel slowly exhaled and lowered himself into a kneeling position again, placing both hands flat on the wooden boards. This time he moved deliberately across a wider section, applying steady pressure in a controlled pattern rather than isolated points. Each contact produced subtle variations in sound, confirming once again that the hollow space below was not random but continuous. He looked up toward the barn walls, noticing something he had not paid attention to earlier. The internal framing did not follow a uniform agricultural design. Instead, certain beams appeared reinforced in a way that suggested load redistribution, almost as if the barn was built around an internal void rather than simply resting on a foundation. "This was never just a barn," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but increasingly certain. Rex moved closer to him, then stopped at a point slightly offset from Daniel's position, indicating another boundary within the same hidden system. Daniel shifted to follow and tested the new area. The result was consistent again: hollow, controlled, and structurally intentional. He stood slowly and began to walk the interior perimeter of the barn, watching Rex carefully as the dog subtly adjusted his position each time Daniel crossed an unseen threshold. It became clear that the floor was divided into segments that behaved differently under pressure, almost like zones within a larger engineered design. Daniel stopped near one of the support beams and looked up along its length. The wood showed signs of age, but the alignment between beam and floor suggested integration that went deeper than visible construction. He placed his hand against the beam and felt a faint vibration through the structure, not from external wind or movement, but from something below transmitting through the frame itself. He stepped back slowly. "There is a system under here," he said quietly. Rex stood still, watching the floor without shifting his gaze. Daniel walked toward the barn entrance again, then turned back, reevaluating the entire space from a distance. From this perspective, the inconsistencies became more visible. Sections of the floor were not only uneven in sound, but subtly arranged in repeating patterns, as if marking access points or boundaries across a hidden layer. He returned his attention to Rex, who remained calm but fully engaged, confirming each point of interest without hesitation. Daniel realized that what they were standing in was not simply an old agricultural structure built and abandoned over time. It was a deliberate cover layer, designed with enough realism to appear ordinary while concealing something far more complex beneath it. And whatever was underneath had already begun responding to their presence, even if they had not yet triggered its full activation. Daniel stayed inside the barn, now fully aware that every step he took across the wooden floor was potentially interacting with something hidden beneath it. The earlier confusion had shifted into structured analysis, the same mindset he had relied on during his military service when reading unstable environments. But this place was not unstable in a destructive sense. It was controlled, intentional, and layered with precision that did not match any rural construction he had ever encountered. Rex remained close, now positioned slightly behind Daniel rather than in front, but his attention still anchored to the floor. The dog's behavior had become more focused, less exploratory, as if confirming a final understanding rather than continuing to search. Daniel moved slowly toward the section where the hollow sound had first been strongest. He crouched again, placing his hands flat on the boards, then pressed downward with consistent pressure across a wider span. The response beneath the surface remained the same, but now he noticed something additional: a faint directional difference in resonance. One side of the floor transmitted sound more deeply than the other, suggesting a boundary line beneath the wood that separated two distinct structural zones. He looked up at the surrounding beams and realized the pattern was repeating not just horizontally, but vertically as well. "This is segmented," he said quietly. "Not one space. Multiple controlled sections." Rex stepped forward and stopped exactly at the point where Daniel had noticed the strongest resonance shift. The alignment was precise, reinforcing the idea that the dog was not reacting randomly, but following a structured detection pattern. Daniel stood and stepped backward to gain perspective. From this angle, The barn floor no longer appeared as a single surface. It appeared divided into carefully arranged sections, each behaving differently under pressure, each possibly concealing different parts of the same underlying system. He walked slowly along the interior again, testing different zones with measured steps. The changes in sound were consistent and repeatable, never chaotic. That consistency confirmed design rather than decay. Daniel exhaled slowly. Someone built this to be hidden in plain sight, he said. Rex remained still, watching him rather than the floor now, as if awaiting a decision rather than continuing analysis. Daniel approached the far side of the barn where the support beams intersected more densely. He placed his hand on one beam and applied slight force. The vibration he had felt earlier returned, stronger this time, as if the structure beneath the barn was not passive but responsive to pressure above it. He withdrew his hand and looked across the entire space once more. The realization settled fully now. The barn was not simply covering empty space. It was functioning as a structural interface, disguising something engineered beneath it with deliberate precision. And whatever lay under the surface was not only preserved but organized in a way that suggested purpose beyond simple storage or concealment. Rex finally broke his stillness and moved one step closer to Daniel, stopping beside him, both of them now facing the same unseen center beneath the barn floor, as if the next step forward would no longer be discovery, but activation of what had been waiting below all along. Daniel stood still inside the barn, now fully aware that every inch of the floor beneath him was part of a deliberately designed concealment system rather than ordinary rural construction. The realization no longer felt like speculation. It had become pattern recognition backed by repeated structural confirmation. Rex stood beside him, no longer shifting between points, but holding a steady position as if the final location had already been identified and no further scanning was required. Daniel slowly walked back toward the central section of the barn, where the strongest resonance difference had been detected earlier. He crouched again, this time placing both hands flat on the wood and applying steady downward pressure across a wider surface area. The hollow response returned instantly, but now he noticed something deeper beneath it. There was a secondary layer of sound variation, almost like two separate void spaces stacked beneath each other with controlled separation. He lifted his hands and looked down, studying the floor not as a surface but as a mapped system. "This is not one level," he said quietly. "It is layered." Rex moved one step forward and stopped again, this time aligning himself with a slightly different section of the same zone. The consistency of his positioning confirmed that the detection was not random but spatially structured. Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the barn's far support beam, placing his hand against it once more. The faint vibration he had felt earlier returned, but now it was clearer, more rhythmic, as if something beneath the barn was maintaining a controlled internal state rather than simply existing in static concealment. He withdrew his hand and looked across the entire barn interior. The structure no longer appeared like an abandoned agricultural building. It now resembled a cover system, designed with intentional irregularities to mask precise engineering beneath it. Daniel walked methodically across the floor, stopping at each point where Rex had previously shown interest. Every location responded with consistent hollow confirmation. There were no random weak points, no signs of natural decay patterns that would explain the uniformity of the anomalies. Everything followed a repeatable structural logic. He exhaled slowly. "This was designed to be walked on without ever being understood," he said. Rex remained calm, watching him rather than the floor now, as if waiting for the moment Daniel would fully accept what the dog had already concluded from the beginning. Daniel stepped back toward the center again, scanning the barn from edge to edge. The beams, the floor segments, the spacing between supports, all of it now aligned into a coherent, hidden geometry. He began to understand that the barn itself was not the discovery. It was the surface layer of something far more complex that extended beneath it in controlled sections, possibly extending beyond the visible boundaries of the structure entirely. Rex suddenly turned his head slightly toward a point near the rear section of the barn, then held still. Daniel noticed the shift immediately and followed his gaze. That area had not yet been physically tested, but based on the pattern, it aligned perfectly with the rest of the structural segmentation. He walked toward it slowly, each step measured. When he reached the point, He paused without touching it yet. The silence felt heavier here, as if the space itself had reached the deepest part of its concealed design. Daniel lowered his hand toward the floor, stopping just above the surface. He hesitated for the first time since entering the barn, understanding that whatever he confirmed next would not simply explain the structure beneath them, but begin revealing the purpose it had been built to hide. Daniel finally lowered his hand onto the barn floor at the exact point Rex had silently indicated. The moment his palm made contact, the sound beneath the wood changed in a way that was no longer subtle or interpretive. It was immediate, layered, and distinctly structured, confirming without ambiguity that this section was directly aligned with the hidden system they had been tracing. He pressed slightly harder, moving his hand a few inches in each direction, and the resonance shifted consistently along a defined boundary line rather than dispersing randomly as it would in natural hollow space. Daniel slowly stood up, his expression tightening as understanding deepened. "This is a boundary interface," he said quietly, "not just a weak point." Rex remained still beside him, but his focus intensified, eyes locked on the same section of floor without deviation. There was no hesitation in the dog's behavior now, only confirmation, as if the full map of what lay beneath had already been internally completed. Daniel took a step back and looked across the barn interior again, but this time the entire space appeared different. The segmented inconsistencies he had previously identified were no longer isolated anomalies. They formed a continuous pattern that extended from one end of the barn to the other, suggesting a coordinated underground layout rather than a single hidden compartment. He walked slowly along the perimeter, testing only key structural points instead of random areas. Each one responded with the same controlled hollow signature. "It is all connected," he said, more to himself than to Rex. The dog shifted slightly and moved one step forward, stopping again at a position that mirrored the structural alignment Daniel had just confirmed. The synchronization between them was becoming increasingly precise, as if both were now operating within the same recognition framework from different perspectives. Daniel looked up at the barn beams again, realizing that the reinforcement patterns above were not supporting decay, but compensating for something beneath. The structure had been intentionally balanced around a concealed system that required stability above and controlled emptiness below. He moved toward the rear section of the barn where Rex had first redirected attention earlier. The air felt slightly different there, not in temperature, but in density, as if the space resisted movement more subtly than the rest of the structure. Daniel stopped just short of the final detection point and looked down. For a long moment, he did not touch anything. He studied the floor as if waiting for it to confirm its own identity. Rex remained perfectly still beside him, watching the same point. Daniel exhaled slowly. "If this opens," he said quietly, "it means this was never just a barn at all." The silence that followed felt heavier than before, not empty, but contained, as if the structure itself was holding its response in reserve. Daniel finally lowered his hand again, hovering just above the surface, preparing to confirm the final point in the sequence they had been following since the moment they stepped inside. Daniel held his hand suspended just above the barn floor at the final detection point, feeling an unusual hesitation he had not experienced in the earlier stages of discovery. It was not fear in the traditional sense, but the awareness that the system beneath him had already been mapped to a point where the next action would transition from observation into interaction. Rex stood beside him, perfectly still, his focus locked on the exact same location, as if confirming that the threshold they had been approaching was now fully defined. Daniel slowly lowered his hand until his palm made full contact with the wooden surface. The response was immediate and fundamentally different from everything before it. The hollow resonance did not simply echo beneath the surface. It stabilized into a structured vibration that felt synchronized across a wider underground network. He pressed gently, then released, then pressed again, and each interaction produced the same controlled feedback pattern, confirming that this was not a random weak point but a designed interface. "This is it," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but noticeably lower than before. Rex shifted his weight slightly, stepping half a pace forward, aligning his position directly beside Daniel's hand. The floor beneath them began to respond more distinctly now, not with physical movement, but with a change in acoustic depth, as if the material itself was transitioning between states of structural awareness. Daniel lifted his hand and stood slowly, scanning the barn interior one final time. The entire space now felt different under this new understanding. What had once appeared as irregular decay and uneven construction had reorganized itself in his perception into a deliberate grid of concealed access points, each one contributing to a larger system beneath the barn floor. He walked a few steps backward, maintaining eye contact with the final point, and observed how Rex remained fixed in position without deviation, reinforcing the exact location of the interface. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Everything leads here," he said. The silence inside the barn deepened further, as if the structure itself was acknowledging the conclusion of their investigation. No wind entered through the open slats, and even the ambient sound of the ranch outside seemed muted by comparison. Daniel stepped forward again, this time more deliberately, and placed both hands on the floor at the final point of contact. The vibration returned, stronger and more coherent than before, confirming full alignment with the underlying system. He held steady, feeling the structure respond in layered intervals beneath him, each one precisely controlled rather than random or collapsing. Rex stood directly beside him now, no longer scanning, but fully oriented toward the same point, as if waiting for the next stage to begin. Daniel finally spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Whatever is under this barn, it has been waiting for this exact moment." The floor remained intact, but the system beneath it was no longer dormant. It had recognized full interaction, and the threshold they had been tracing across every previous section had now consolidated into a single confirmed access point. Daniel kept both hands pressed firmly against the final point in the barn floor, maintaining steady pressure as he studied the response beneath him. The vibration was no longer subtle or fragmented. It had become stable, rhythmic, and fully synchronized across the surrounding section, confirming that the interface they had identified was now actively engaged with their presence. Rex stood immediately beside him, unmoving, his focus locked on the exact same location without any sign of distraction or uncertainty. Daniel slowly lifted one hand, then placed it back down again, testing consistency rather than change. Each contact produced the same controlled structural feedback, as if the system beneath the barn was acknowledging repeated validation rather than reacting randomly. He stood upright and looked across the interior space once more. The barn no longer appeared as a simple agricultural structure with hidden anomalies. It now revealed itself as a deliberate overlay, a visible shell designed to conceal a fully integrated underground system beneath it. The patterns he had traced earlier were no longer isolated sections of hollow sound. They formed a complete network that converged precisely at the point where he now stood. Daniel exhaled slowly. "It is centered here," he said quietly. Rex shifted his stance slightly, but remained aligned with Daniel and the same structural point, reinforcing the conclusion through position rather than movement. Daniel took a few steps backward, observing the barn from a wider perspective. From this distance, the alignment of beams, floor sections, and reinforcement points formed a pattern that was no longer coincidental. It resembled a mapped structure, carefully designed to distribute weight while concealing internal access. He began to understand that the barn was not hiding a single space, but serving as the top layer of a much larger system extending beneath the ranch. Daniel returned his attention to the floor and slowly knelt again. This time, he placed both hands not to test for sound, but to confirm stability. The surface held firm, yet the response beneath it remained active, controlled, and structured. It did not collapse or shift. It maintained integrity while clearly indicating a functional system below. Rex leaned forward slightly, then stopped, maintaining his position as if awaiting confirmation of the next step. Daniel spoke again, his voice steady but more deliberate. "This is not just hidden space," he said. "This is engineered access." The realization settled fully now. Everything they had observed since entering the barn pointed to a deliberate design, one that required specific alignment and recognition to reach this exact point. The silence inside the structure felt heavier, not empty, but concentrated, as if the barn itself was holding its state in anticipation. Daniel slowly stood again and looked down at the final interface point. Whatever lay beneath was no longer a question of existence. It was a question of access. and the system had already confirmed they were standing at the correct location to proceed. Daniel stood motionless for several seconds, keeping his gaze fixed on the exact interface point in the barn floor. The silence around him felt compressed, as if the structure itself had entered a standby state awaiting final confirmation. Rex remained perfectly aligned beside him, no longer scanning or shifting position, but holding a steady, focused stance directed at the same location. Daniel slowly lowered himself into a kneeling position again, this time more deliberately than before. Both hands rested flat on the wood, and he applied a measured, controlled pressure across the surface. The response beneath the floor was immediate and consistent, but now it carried a deeper structural signature. The vibration was no longer limited to a localized hollow area. It extended outward in faint, synchronized patterns, suggesting connectivity to a broader underground system beyond the barn itself. Daniel lifted one hand and repositioned it slightly to the left, then repeated the pressure test. The response shifted in parallel, confirming that the interface was not a single access point, but part of a larger distributed mechanism. He exhaled slowly and stood up again, scanning the barn interior with a different level of awareness. The structure no longer appeared static. It appeared responsive. "It is not just here," he said quietly. "It connects outward." Rex took a single step forward, then stopped again, reinforcing the exact point where the system's strongest response originated. Daniel followed his movement and looked down once more, realizing that the barn floor was functioning as a controlled surface interface rather than a passive structural layer. He walked a slow circle around the central area, carefully observing how each section of flooring responded differently under his proximity. Some zones remained inert, while others produced faint resonance feedback that aligned in predictable intervals. The pattern was no longer fragmented. It was organized. He stopped at the edge of the interface region and placed his hand against a nearby support beam. A faint vibration traveled through the structure, confirming that the system was not limited to the floor alone. The entire barn frame was integrated into a single concealed design. Daniel stepped back again, now fully aware that what they had identified was not simply a hidden compartment, but a coordinated structural gateway. Rex remained close, his attention unwavering, as if awaiting final action rather than further discovery. Daniel spoke softly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of realization. "This was built as a threshold," he said, "not a storage space." The barn remained silent, but the absence of sound no longer felt empty. It felt controlled, as if the structure was maintaining equilibrium while waiting for the correct sequence to proceed. Daniel looked down at the interface point one final time. The confirmation was complete. They were not simply uncovering something hidden beneath the ranch. They were standing at the exact activation boundary of a system that had been intentionally designed to remain dormant until now. Daniel remained still for a long moment, standing directly over the confirmed interface point in the barn floor. The realization that he had reached a structural boundary rather than a simple hidden compartment settled fully in his mind. Everything they had discovered up to this moment pointed to a coordinated system beneath the ranch, and this point in the barn was not the end of that discovery, but the controlled threshold that defined access to it. Rex stood beside him without movement, his posture steady and fully oriented toward the same section of floor, as if acknowledging that the phase of exploration had shifted into something more precise and deliberate. Daniel slowly lowered himself again, placing one hand on the wood, but this time he did not apply exploratory pressure. Instead, he held contact steadily, observing for any change in response. The vibration beneath the surface remained consistent, but now it carried a structured rhythm, repeating in measured intervals that suggested synchronization with a deeper mechanism. He removed his hand and looked across the barn interior once more. The structure no longer appeared as a collection of hidden anomalies. It now resembled a unified system with a clearly defined central access boundary anchored beneath the exact position where he stood. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is a controlled entry point," he said quietly. Rex shifted slightly, then returned to stillness, reinforcing the exact location through his positioning. Daniel stepped back a few feet, studying the floor pattern from a wider angle. The segmentation he had identified earlier now aligned into a coherent geometric distribution centered around this interface zone. It was not random reinforcement, or accidental decay. It was deliberate design intended to conceal both access and function beneath a surface that appeared entirely ordinary. He walked slowly toward the barn wall, then traced his attention back across the beams and floor supports, realizing that every structural element was contributing to stability around a concealed core beneath them. The barn itself was acting as a protective shell. Daniel returned to the center point and stood quietly for several seconds. The silence inside the structure felt concentrated, as if the entire environment had shifted into a state of readiness. Rex remained close, unwavering, his focus still locked on the same point. Daniel spoke softly, more to himself than to the space around him. "It is not hidden by chance," he said. "It is secured by design." The barn did not respond visibly, but the subtle vibration beneath the floor remained active, confirming continuous system presence below. Daniel looked down one final time, understanding that what they had identified was not simply an anomaly within an old ranch structure. It was a deliberately engineered threshold, and everything they had observed so far had been guiding them toward this exact point of controlled access. Daniel stood motionless at the center of the barn, fully aware that the threshold beneath his feet was no longer just a point of detection, but a confirmed access interface to something far more extensive below the ranch. The subtle vibration beneath the floor had not diminished. Instead, it maintained a steady rhythm, as if the system below was sustaining a controlled state of readiness in direct response to their presence. Rex remained at his side, perfectly still, his attention fixed on the same exact location without deviation, reinforcing the sense that no further searching was required. Daniel slowly lowered himself again, placing both hands flat on the wooden surface. This time, he did not test for weakness or variation. He held steady contact, observing the response pattern as it stabilized under his touch. The vibration beneath the floor did not fluctuate. It aligned, consistent, measured, controlled. He slowly lifted his hands and stood again, scanning the entire barn interior with a new level of understanding. What had once appeared as an abandoned agricultural structure now revealed itself as a deliberate containment layer. Every beam, every floor segment, every reinforcement point was positioned in relation to a central structural core. Beneath the barn, Daniel exhaled quietly. "This is not an access point," he said. "It is a secured interface." Rex shifted slightly, then returned to stillness, maintaining his alignment with the exact center point, as if acknowledging the statement without needing further validation. Daniel walked slowly toward the barn wall and traced his gaze along the interior framework. The more he observed, the more the design revealed itself as intentional segmentation rather than random construction. Certain beams carried reinforcement that served no visible agricultural purpose. Certain floor sections distributed weight in patterns that suggested something far larger existed beneath the visible structure. He returned to the center again and looked down. The interface point remained unchanged, but its presence now felt definitive rather than exploratory. The system beneath it was no longer being discovered. It was being acknowledged. Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Whatever is below this barn, it was not buried," he said. "It was protected." Rex stood close, unmoving, fully oriented toward the same point, reinforcing the conclusion through presence alone. The barn remained silent, but the silence itself felt structured, as if maintaining controlled separation between the surface world and whatever lay beneath. Daniel understood now that every step, every detection, and every structural anomaly had been guiding them toward this exact position. Not to uncover something lost, but to reach a point where access was finally possible. He looked down one final time, fully aware that the interface beneath them was no longer a mystery. It was a threshold waiting for activation, and everything they had done had already confirmed they were standing exactly where the system intended them to be. Daniel remained standing directly over the interface point inside the barn, fully aware that what lay beneath was no longer theoretical or partially confirmed, but structurally validated through every test they had performed. The vibration beneath the floor had settled into a steady, deliberate rhythm, as if the system below was maintaining a controlled active state, specifically calibrated to their presence. Rex stood beside him without movement, his entire focus locked on the exact center point, no longer shifting or scanning, but holding a fixed alignment that confirmed the final stage of recognition had been reached. Daniel slowly lowered his gaze to the floor again, then placed both hands on the wood one final time. This was no longer a test. It was confirmation. The response beneath the surface did not fluctuate. It held steady, synchronized, and complete. A controlled interface maintaining readiness beneath an agricultural structure that no longer functioned as a barn in any conventional sense. He exhaled slowly and stood upright, looking across the entire interior space with a level of clarity that had not been present before. Every irregularity he had identified earlier now aligned into a coherent structural system, centered precisely beneath where he stood. The barn was not hiding something randomly beneath it. It was constructed around it. Daniel spoke quietly, his voice steady and final. "This is not concealment," he said. "This is protection." Rex did not move, but his stillness now felt absolute, as if acknowledging completion rather than waiting for further instruction. Daniel took a slow step backward, then another, widening his perspective of the barn interior. From this distance, the entire structure revealed itself as an intentional outer shell, designed to distribute load, misdirect interpretation, and preserve whatever existed beneath in a stable condition over time. The floor was no longer a surface. It was a barrier layer. The beams were no longer support structures. They were containment architecture. He returned his attention to the center point and stood still. The realization had fully formed now. Everything they had observed since entering the ranch had been guiding them toward this exact location. Not to uncover a hidden space in the simple sense, but to reach a controlled interface designed to remain dormant until the correct conditions were met. Rex shifted slightly, then resumed his exact position beside Daniel, reinforcing the center without needing movement or sound. Daniel looked down one final time and understood that the system beneath them was not reacting to discovery. It was responding to authorization. The barn remained silent, but the silence was no longer empty. It was structured, maintained, and intentional. Daniel's voice lowered as he spoke the final realization aloud. "We are not looking for what is hidden anymore," he said. "We are standing on what was waiting to be reached." The interface beneath the barn held steady, fully active, as both man and dog remained aligned at its center, marking the end of discovery and the beginning of whatever the system had been designed to initiate.